Amarawa Hopa, thank you so much for joining us for this special half-hour interview with Minnesota Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. I'm Aaliyah Chavez, the anchor of the ICT Newscast. I'm here in St. Paul, Minnesota at the Minnesota State Capitol, where I sat down with Peggy Flanagan earlier today ahead of a historic next few months. If Governor Tim Walz and Vice President Kamala Harris are successfully elected in November, Peggy Flanagan would become the first Native woman to be the governor of any state in U.S. history. Here's our conversation. Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, thank you so much for welcoming us. Really quickly, tell us where we're at.
Sure. So we're in the Minnesota State Capitol. We are seated outside of one of my favorite places in the Capitol called the Loggia, which is basically the balcony that looks out on the front lawn of the Capitol. And behind us is the House chambers where I served 2 terms. So excited to welcome you here in this rotunda, and it's so beautiful. So welcome, and it's fun to host you here today.
Thank you so much. I want this conversation to be all about your journey. You just mentioned that you, of course, are a state representative. Now you're the lieutenant governor, but I want to start all the way from the beginning. Tell us about your childhood. You know, what was little Peggy Flanagan like?
She was probably a handful. So I grew up in the community of St. Louis Park, which is a first-ring suburb of Minneapolis. And my mom moved us there when I was a baby, using a Section 8 housing voucher to secure an apartment. And my mom chose that community because of the good schools, a great neighborhood, and a strong community. And we relied on public programs growing up. So things like the Child Care Assistance Program allowed my mom to go back to school and get a better paying job. SNAP, which back in the day we called food stamps. I was that kid on free and reduced price lunch. And I'm alive today because of medical assistance. So it's a really important part of my story because those public programs helped to lift my family into the middle class, and now I get to pay that back and pay that forward. But also make sure that people who are directly impacted by the decisions that we make here in this beautiful building, right, also are deeply connected to the folks who are on the front lines. And having that lived experience, I think, has served me well here. I was one of a handful of Native kids in my school, and that felt, you know, a bit isolating. I think, you know, now watching my daughter, who has Ojibwe culture and language twice a week at school, and goes to school with, you know, over 50 Native kids in the same community where I grew up, is really exciting. And so those things are changing. But I never thought that I wanted to be lieutenant governor when I grew up. That was not my plan. But there were many things that happened in my life that kind of put me on this path to be here talking to you today.
I heard you give a speech recently where you talked about your dad and sort of the role that he played in your life. Our viewers probably don't know a lot about him, though, so tell us more.
Sure. So there are 2 reactions that I get when people find out who my dad is. Marvin Penny is my father, and the 2 reactions are, "Oh, Marvin's your dad," or "Oh, Marvin's your dad." Like there's like never like any in between. And I think honestly that's because he was a bit of a hellraiser, but in the way like to serve his people. My dad was an expert on our tribal constitution. I think he should have probably had an honorary law degree because he knew the law forwards and backwards. I didn't grow up with my dad. My dad struggled with substance abuse, and you know, he'd say, "My girl, I'm glad that I can be part of your life now when I'm healthy and I can be a good dad." And so we lost my dad in January of 2020. And it was incredibly difficult, but I still feel him all the time. And, you know, one of the things that my dad would talk about is, you know, he'd say, "My girl, I want to burn down the system and you want to change it from the inside out. We need both." And I think that's right. In many ways, I'm the perfect combination of both of my parents, because like my mom's first job out of high school was working on Hubert Humphrey's presidential election in 1968. And my dad didn't really vote until I was on the ballot in 2018. And then wore a t-shirt all over town and told everybody that they had to vote. So, you know, one of the things that he said was our right to govern ourselves is inherently ours. And that is a guidepost for me all the time. And I'm so grateful that we had the time we did together. And my favorite part is when people are like, you know who you look like? Marvin Moneypenny. Are you related to him at all? And I'm like, that's my dad, right? So, you know, we've got a look, but he was able to see me be sworn in as lieutenant governor. And I had my mom and my dad there, and it was amazing.
What was his reaction when he saw you after that?
He cried, which didn't happen a lot. My dad was really proud of me. And even though I was working in a system that he wanted to dismantle, but saw, you know, saw the good that we could do. So, and one of my favorite, you know, memories as he was getting ready to walk on is how many pairs of shoes there were by the door, right? And that was just, it was winter time, right? And just how many people loved him and valued him and wanted to be with him in his last moments. Yeah.
I'm so glad that you shared that, because, you know, all over Indian country, we often see this real issue of parents not being able to be there for their children for a number of reasons. And, you know, when I go back to my tribal community of Giwa Pueblo, I mean, it's the same thing. Sometimes parents just aren't able to be there for their kids. And I too grew up without my dad, and it's completely possible to reach your dreams or, you know, go for things that you never even imagined without having, you know, both of your parents. So that's really powerful.
And it's, and I'm so lucky, right? Because our stories don't always turn out that way. So I'm grateful that he could be healthy and in a place for me, and he was right on time in my life. Yeah.
I want to talk about the first time that you knew, I want to run for public office. Like, what was that conversation like in your head?
I worked in the community. So my first job out of college was at the Division of Indian Work in South Minneapolis. So I ran a program called Parents Plus that helped bridge the gap between home and school for Native kids and their families. And through that process, just realized how Native families weren't being served in the way that they could be, and spent a long time building relationships with people. So I met with members of the school board and the superintendent and city council members and state representatives, because I was like, I want you to know what's happening in our community. And through that process, Judy Farmer, who is a member of the school board, I used to joke, like, since time immemorial, she had been on the board longer than I had been alive at that point. I was 24. And she said, you should run for the school board. And I was like, no, but I'll help you find somebody. I was like, I'm 24, I don't have kids in the district, right? Like, I can't do this. And then we had a meeting at the Minneapolis American Indian Center, and I was like, I'm gonna recruit somebody to run. And Clyde Bellecourt had just gotten done giving one of his like big, you know, with the blood of Geronimo running through our veins, sort of like, you know, like mic droppers. And, you know, then the MC for the meeting, it was about education, was like, does anybody else have anything to add? And I was like, I do. And I said, you know, we need a voice on the school board. Talk to me if you want to run, and I'll help you. So then a bunch of folks came up to me and they're like, my girl, why don't you do it? They said, it's election time, you come around here and you want people to vote, like, you care about this, why don't you try? And I was like, I can't do that, I can't do that. And so then I was driving home, and I was like, well, maybe I can do that. And I called Marcia Avner, who was Senator Paul Wellstone's communications director. And she said, if not you, then who? And I never thought that we would win, but I thought it was really important to get the issues that we cared about out there into the debate. Well, it turns out that a lot of people agreed with what we were talking about. And I got a lot of advice about where to knock, which voters to target, and folks said, don't bother, knocking in those areas. Those people don't vote. And I was like, I am those people, and that's where we're going to spend time. And so I was the highest vote getter ever in a school board election at that time, and served for 4 years, and was able, to work in partnership with the community and do some good work. And I never thought that I'd run for office at 24, right? So, yeah.
24, my goodness. And when you were elected to the Minnesota State House of Representatives, the first time you walked into the Capitol, take me through that experience. I mean, we can see the chamber right behind us.
So I was an advocate. I worked at Children's Defense Fund, was the executive director there, co-chaired the Raise the Wage campaign, and did a lot of advocacy work in these halls, and was like, man, we need more people who care about children and families and sort of know about family economic security issues. And was grateful that my state representative was the chief author of Raise the Wage. And he said, when I decide to do something else, you should think about running for this seat. And I was like, oh, I don't know, but thanks for thinking of me. 6 months later, he was like, I'm moving to Belgium. So this seat is going to be open and you should run for it. And I was like, okay, right? So got a bunch of folks together in a room, and I was like, we got to put together a campaign, and we did. And I actually ran unopposed the first time that I ran, but we ran like we were 10 points behind, door knocking constantly, because I wanted people to know, I am in this for the community. And then I had to turn right around and run for re-election. And I felt totally overwhelmed and grateful to be able to do the work, pretty nervous. And now when I walk into this space, still have a feeling of, I oftentimes talk about the fact that I take 2 breaths before I walk in. The first breath is a breath of protection, right? Coming into a system that wasn't necessarily made for us. And the second breath, just as an acknowledgement to the responsibility and the good work that I have to do for the people of Minnesota.
That's really beautiful.
Yeah, thanks.
Tell me about the first time that you met Tim Walz.
It was literally maybe a mile, not even, down the road at the Carpenter's Hall here in St. Paul. We were doing a training for Camp Wellstone. I was one of the trainers because I had just been elected to the Minneapolis Board of Education. And he came in and he was wearing jeans and a t-shirt and tennis shoes, and he's like, I'm Tim Walz and I want to run for Congress in the 1st Congressional District. And we were like, as a Democrat? He's like, yeah. And we're like, okay, good luck. A Democrat hasn't won in a very long time there, but coming in. And just watched him throughout the weekend. He was like a sponge, learning as much as he could, taking feedback from people, really knew who he was as an individual, as a teacher and a coach, a veteran. All of those pieces, are really part of who he is. And now America is seeing his big dad energy, right? And that was on full display. I went to Mankato in 2006, and I knocked on doors in a community where I did not live because I just thought he was such an incredible leader. That hasn't stopped. Just me watching him lead with heart and a sense of humor, and feel really grateful to have been able to be on this journey with him, really from the very beginning to now, as everything is sort of changing. It's amazing, but really it's powerful.
Mm-hmm. I watched a video this week, actually, of Vice President Harris reaching Governor Tim Walz's voicemail.
Yes.
When she's calling him, asking, do you want to be my vice presidential pick? And, he goes, I didn't recognize the call, so I didn't answer.
Yep.
I want to know the story of how when he called you and said, Peggy Flanagan, I want you to run with me on the Democratic ticket. What was that moment like?
So he asked me to have a meeting to talk about, like, he was already running for governor and wanted to talk about some of my areas of expertise and policy. So paid family and medical leave and childcare are kind of my jam. And I was like, great, come to my office. So he came to my office right over here at the state office building. We talked about it. He's like, I also want to talk to you about who I want to select for my lieutenant governor. And I was like, oh, great. I have like some ideas. What are you thinking? And he was like, oh, well, I just have one name on the list. And I was like, oh my gosh, who is it, right? And he said, it's you. And I was like, haha, no, seriously, like, who is it? And he's like, I'm serious. And I was like, well, now this meeting has become political and we can't have it in the state office building and you have to go. So I said, let me think about it. And I immediately, as soon as he left my office, I immediately called Tina Smith, our United States Senator, who had been an amazing lieutenant governor. And I said, what do I do? And she said, come over tomorrow morning, we'll have some coffee and we'll take a walk around the lake and we'll talk about it. She is my mentor and amazing. And over the coming weeks, Tim Walz and I talked about what that partnership would look like, that I didn't want to be window dressing, right? I didn't want to be relegated to an office working on like one issue, and came to a good spot where like, this is the partnership that we want to have. And then I was like, all right, there's a lot of risk. I'm going to leave my seat, but it's worth it to start to highlight the issues that like we care about, and frankly, to increase the visibility of Native American women in this state. Mm-hmm.
It sounds to me like when you were talking to him, you were like, I have ideas and I want to sit and put those ideas into action.
Yep.
What was his response to that? Was he like, let's do it, or?
Yes, and he was like, that's why I want you to run with me. You have lived experience and expertise that's different than mine. Mm. And he's like, and I have experiences that, you know, are different from yours. And I think that's kind of the beauty of our ticket. Like, we launched our campaign a year before the election because we wanted people to know what they were going to get, and so that people could see themselves reflected in, you know, our ticket. And what I see right now happening is really similar, right? That Kamala Harris and Tim Walz have different lived experience, but they have the same values, and both were raised in like middle-class families, had parents who worked really hard, and you know, can see that on display in this moment too. And one of my favorite things is that like Tim Walz really knows how to be a good partner to a woman, and to a woman leader, and to a Native woman specifically. And so I think Kamala Harris will be well served by her vice president.
I want to talk about the moment that you found out that Tim Walz was getting chosen to be the vice presidential pick.
Yeah, so the lead up to that was sort of wild, right? And you know, since that has been completely bananas, but in all the best ways. I saw a tweet from Jim Acosta and CNN.
I'm sorry, you found out in a tweet?
Uh-huh. It was locked down, as it should be, right? And so it's like everybody was like, the number one job of a lieutenant governor is to be ready. So like, you gotta stay ready to be ready, right? And immediately, I was on vacation with my family. I got on the first ferry off Block Island, got in a car, went to the airport, and came home. And my family stayed on vacation. But the first call that I got was from Secretary Holland. And she just said some of the kindest things that I've ever heard. And I was literally in a car driving to the airport. And that was my first call, and then I started crying. I was like, I'm the Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota. Tim Walz just got selected as the vice presidential nominee. That is what is happening, and my phone is melting, right? And literally within 20 minutes, I had 396 text messages in my phone. And so like, I am still like getting through all of them. And then as soon as I got to the airport, my phone rang, and it was the governor. And we had this call that was happy and giddy, and he was like, we just still do the work. We just keep doing the work. So everybody gets to see the Tim Walz that I know across the country, and it's really fun. And we get to highlight the incredible work that we've been able to do here as partners to govern for Minnesota. Like, folks are just hearing about it, and it's awesome.
Yeah. I imagine that call, he's like, hey, Lieutenant Governor, I'm going to be out of the office a little bit. I'm going to need you to step up.
Yep. So, we already work so closely together in our cabinet room. They're literally like 2 seats at the head of the table. As we have meetings together, we lean over and conference and then come back together. So that's not too different. My schedule is quite busy already, but I'll pick up something here and there. We are in constant communication. So yes, his plate certainly is more full, but I'm confident that, Minnesotans will still be well served over the coming months.
Day one of Harris-Walz administration, do you feel confident that he would be ready to partner with Indian country? Like day one, is that something he's ready to do?
He already does it. And so part of, what he said when we first started to work together, he's like, I want Minnesota to be the best state in the country for tribal-state relations. And we've created an office. We've passed, historic legislation that came out of those partnerships, like Indigenous Education for All, the country's first state-based missing and murdered Indigenous relatives office. We codified into law tribal consultation with our state agencies. Every leader in our administration has to go through tribal state relations training. I have just watched legislation pass and the work that we've been able to do, and it wouldn't have happened unless he was dedicated to it. So I think Indian country should be excited that the vice president understands treaty rights, tribal sovereignty, has deep relationships and friendships with Native leaders, and building on what the Biden-Harris administration has already done. The sky's the limit. And for Vice President Harris in Arizona to say, we will honor treaty rights and tribal sovereignty, and when she riffs about the communities she will represent, it's urban, rural, and tribal, that matters, and that's not an accident. And I think, support in Indian country, I think is evident through what we've been able to do here. And the more time that he spends across Indian country, I've been a surrogate in Native communities for Joe Biden and then, for Kamala Harris. There is no better surrogate than Tim Walz and his ability to speak to these issues. I can't wait.
I want to talk about the future now.
Yeah.
If the Democrats win the presidential ticket, you'll make history as the first Native woman to be the governor of any state in U.S. history. That's a mouthful. Tell me what you feel, what reaction you feel when you hear that.
So the governor's still the governor, but I think already knowing that as lieutenant governor, right, like I'm the highest ranking Native woman in executive office, and the responsibility that goes along with that, also the beauty of that and being able to serve. I think about when I was growing up, that the only leader that I really saw like as a woman was Geraldine Ferraro when she was the vice presidential pick for Walter Mondale in 1984. And now my daughter has all these examples, right? It's like Auntie Deb and Auntie Charisse and Auntie Jamie, who's the chair of the House Judiciary Committee here in Minnesota. And her mom's the lieutenant governor, and she's like, right? Like, but like, that's amazing. because her reality is so different. So I will continue to lead as an Anishinaabe Kwe. That is not a hat that I can take on and off. But I'd be honored and humbled to be able to serve the people of Minnesota in that way, and know it's about time for all of us that we had a Native woman as governor. If it's me, that's wonderful. If it's not me, it'll be somebody else very quickly.
Well, Lieutenant Governor, I thank you so much for all of the time that you've shared with us, and most importantly, your story. I think so many people will relate to, what you've shared with us, so thank you.
Thanks so much.